Hi. Coincidentally, I'm standing outside the university parks again, as I did yesterday. But the focus of my video is different. It accompanies a previous video on Tumbling Bay and Botley Park, which is one of Oxford's bathing places. And I'm going to talk about a different bathing place this time. People who know the parks may guess that this is Parson's Pleasure. When I put up the Botley Park Tumbling Bay video, somebody commented asking which Oxford. I don't know what they meant, but it might be that they were referring to the town versus gown division, the residence versus the university. And Tumbling Bay versus Parson's Pleasure is an example of that, I suppose, because Tumbling Bay must have been largely non-university people, and Parson's Pleasure is very much associated with the university, though I'm sure others bathed there too. So I'm now heading through the parks towards the cycle path, and Parson's Pleasure is a little way along that. So this time I'm going the other side of the cricket pavilion and closer to the science area. There's the pavilion from the side. And I'm doing this fairly early in the day because it's sunny but beginning to cloud over, and I want sun for this video in connection with a piece of poetry. You'll see why. So that's the pavilion in a sort of three-quarter view, partly from behind with the sun shining on it. and it's a little under 2 hours before noon, so the shadows are still quite long. There's a particular type of dankness which overtakes grassy and vegetated areas in this sort of weather, when it looks sort of superficially nice and warm and sunny, but there are areas that just doesn't reach. This is Hayrick's border, which was recently redone with a path running down behind it alongside the fence. Today I'm going to walk in front. And I'm now going to come out briefly onto South Parks Road and then re-enter the parks along the cycle path, which is another useful reference point. This is the South Lodge, which was built for the park superintendent. It's alongside the cycle path. And I'm now going to walk a little way along the cycle path to find Parson's Pleasure. So I'm still on the cycle path walking towards New Marston, but I'm not going to go nearly as far as New Marston. That's an entrance to the parks, or the main part of the parks, and the cricket pavilion is somewhere over there. That's the cycle path. And this is a little bit of land just to one side of the cycle path. That's the bridge that is carrying the cycle path. And that is a weir where one level of the Cherwell flows into the other. As you can see, it's quite ferocious. And these are a very well-known landmark, and it is part of the experience of everybody who's learnt to punt round here, to have learnt to negotiate them. They're called the rollers, and they're steel rollers with which you drag your punt, or over which you drag your punt, to avoid the weir. So you have to disembark, if that's the right word for getting out of a punt, here, and then pull the punt up there, and then re-embark, and similarly when going in the other direction. So those are the rollers. And roughly due west of the rollers is Parson's Pleasure. I've never seen it signposted, and I'm not sure exactly where it is. I think at one time it was hidden by a large piece of corrugated iron fencing to screen it off from the eyes of susceptible female undergraduates, but I think it is probably somewhere around here. I'm just looking for a sort of bay. That would seem a plausible spot, or perhaps a little bit nearer the seat. No, I'll come back to that sign. So, a bit of geography. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the Middle East, there's a piece of land called Mesopotamia, which just means between the rivers in Greek. And there is another piece of land called Mesopotamia in the Oxford University parks. Depending on what you read, either this is Mesopotamia, or Mesopotamia is a long, thin river island along a path in that direction, which I think is more likely. It's a long, thin river island, about 800 yards by 30 yards, and it's just before Kingsmill Lane. That connects an exit entrance to the parks with Marston Road, and Kingsmill Lane is right slap north of the University Islamic Studies Centre, that peculiar combination of mosque and college quadrangle architecture that was built recently. Okay, so that's Mesopotamia, and there is a Mesopotamia walk which extends in this direction from Mesopotamia, and Parson's Pleasure is generally said to be on that. So if you come across references to Mesopotamia and Parson's Pleasure, you haven't fallen into some Middle Eastern dream, you are actually still in Oxford. Now to me, this looks like a fairly reasonable sort of bathing spot, as long as there are no deep under-river currents. So it may well be that this is actually Parson's Pleasure, or possibly it's just a little bit in that direction. I'm not going to bend over the vegetation because I don't want to drop anything into the river, including myself. And it's worth saying that Mesopotamia Walk is not all that old in Oxford terms. The university parks were being set up in the 1850s, and some more land was bought in 1860 to 1865, and that includes the 4 acres that make up Mesopotamia Walk. It's also worth noting, this sort of points up my comment about age. Kingsmill Lane is named after an actual mill, and it's a mill which was recorded in the Domesday Book, and it continued milling until 1825, and the upper level of the Charwell was in fact its mill stream. So what about Parson's Pleasure? When I did Tumbling Bay, I said that it had been closed by the council in 1990 or 1991. Since you can still swim there, both physically and, as far as I know, legally, that raises the question of what closing it actually means. And as far as I could make out, it meant that bathing huts and maybe 1 or 2 other bits and pieces had been removed. There used to be bathing huts where people would change, and they're no longer there. Histories of Parson's Pleasure say that it was closed in 1991, so presumably there were bathing huts there too which were removed. I don't know what happened about permission to swim. I don't know whether the notice that I pointed to in that direction just applies to that little tiny bit of the river, or more generally to this stretch or throughout the parks, and I don't know whether it's a university prohibition or a council prohibition. Going back to what I said about huts, there certainly do seem to have been huts here, bathing huts, because they're mentioned in at least one piece of poetry, and I'm going to read you that now. It was written by somebody called Christopher Morley and published in his collection Parson's Pleasure in 1923. And this is it. A green gloom side loop of the creek, a sodden place of twilight smell, clear dayshine did not often touch that water, and a mouldy hutch for the convenience of undressing. An ancient, far from prepossessing, offered uncandid towels, eschewed by most. There men's white bodies, nude, unconscious, comely, gallant, Greek, stretched, tingled cool, shone sleek, lived well, in the one patch where sun warm fell. That's Christopher Morley, 1923, and the poem is worth thinking about for its own sake, and it is, by the way, why I pointed to the dankness in the heart of the sunshine earlier on when I was passing the science area. But I'm also referring to it because he uses the word hutch, which I've come across in American novels before, as their word for something like a bathing hut. And I presume that's what he's talking about here. Have to say he doesn't make Parson's pleasure sound particularly welcome, but then that's British weather for you. His friend C.E. Montague wrote the following: "Considered physically as a bathing place and not as a temple, Parson's pleasure was mediocre. Slugs in the dressing hutches, no life in the water, no sun to stand in when drying, the chill of a morgue over the whole place on all but the most fervent dog days." Fervent here has its literal meaning of boiling, I believe. Well, again, that seems pretty fair, and it's what the British weather gives you. There generally is a dankness about a lot of Oxford, which only dispels on 1 or 2 days a year. So that's Parson's pleasure, the environment, and the ending. When did it start? I can't find out when the hutches or huts were put in, but apparently the name has been known since at least 1832, and the area used for swimming since 1844, which we know from various newspaper references. And it's most connected with, in stories and jokes, it's most connected with the university. There's university folklore about it. The most famous one that I know is this. There's a group of dons of academics sunbathing naked here, perhaps on that very piece of grass, looking like beached whales. And a punt passes with a girl in it, and all the dons leap up and hastily cover their genitals, except one who puts his hands over his face, and he says sternly to the others, "I don't know about you, gentlemen, but in Oxford I am known by my face." So, that's Parson's pleasure. I'll see you next time.